Northeast Asia in the late 4th century, where the rough winds of Manchuria raged, was a melting pot of chaos where slaughter and betrayal for survival never ceased, and over that cold earth, a black wave of steel was rushing in with a roar that shook the axis of the earth. Goguryeo Gaemamusa armored cavalry, covered from head to toe in iron armor. Both horse and rider were not merely cavalrymen, but living killing machines with the impact force of modern tanks, and where they passed, only crushed flesh and broken bones remained, miserably proving that this place had once been a battlefield of humans. The wars of conquest by Gwanggaeto the Great, which we have only encountered through a few lines of text in textbooks, were in reality a feast of destructive power, closer to a natural disaster than rational tactics, filled with the smell of blood thicker than dust. At the center of this massive storm stood a man named Damdeok, who carved the direct and arrogant posthumous name, Gwanggaeto, meaning, broad opener of land, into history. He was not a ruler who sat on a throne issuing orders, but a beast-like warrior aiming for the enemy's heart at the very front. In 391, just before Damdeok ascended the throne, the situation of Goguryeo was far from the majesty of a great empire. We imagine it was in a desperate crisis, surrounded by enemies on all sides. Baekje to the south was an unforgivable main enemy that had killed King Goguryeo of Goguryeo and threatened Pyongyang fortress later. Yan to the west was tightening Goguryeo's throat, eyeing an advance into Liaodong, and the Khitan to the north were hyena-like existences crossing the border to plunder the world seen through the eyes of Damdeok, who ascended the throne at the young age of 18, was a massive arena that did not even allow time to grieve for his father, and upon his accession, he proclaimed the independent era name, Youngnek Eternal Joy, announcing to the world that he was a son of heaven equal to the emperors of the Central Plains, and that the war starting now was not for defense, but for annihilation. His first blade was aimed at Baekje, his grandfather's enemy and the constant harasser of Goguryeo's southern border. This was not merely territorial expansion, but the prelude to a holy war to wash away the defeat accumulated for decades in the hearts of the Goguryeo people and to rebuild the nation's pride. The conquest of Baekje, carried out in 392, the year after his accession, was a shocking debut match, demonstrating how meticulous and overwhelming the mobility of the Goguryeo army was. Damdeok led 40,000 troops and ravaged Baekje's northern defense line like a storm, capturing over 10 castles, including Sohyeongshung Fortress in an instant. This was the pinnacle of speed warfare, climbing walls and smashing gates before the Baekje army could even assume a defensive posture. In particular, the Battle of Gwanmishung, known as an impregnable fortress, was a scene where Gwanggaeto's tactical genius was displayed without regret to attack this natural fortress. Surrounded by sheer cliffs and the sea on four sides, he mobilized the navy instead of cavalry to blockade the sea and launched simultaneous amphibious operations. Amidst wave after wave of attacks continuing day and night for 20 days, the Goguryeo army piled up mountains of corpses to climb the walls, eventually completely breaking the morale of the Baekje army and seizing the strategic key point north of the Han River, which also placed the maritime control of the West Sea into Goguryeo's hands. King Asen of Baekje knelt and declared a humiliating surrender, saying he would become a vassal slave forever. But for Damdeok, Baekje was not the endpoint of conquest, but merely a safety mechanism in the rear to expand into the vast continent. Having removed the threat from the south, Gwanggaeto turned his horse's head north and embarked on a conquest of the Khitan Goguryeo, which had long tormented Goguryeo. This expedition was not a general march along a set path, but like extreme maneuver training, breaking through pathless snowfields and rugged mountain ranges. According to the records on the Gwanggaeto stele, he destroyed 600 to 700 Khitan villages from Busan to Yeomshu, which means he penetrated deep into the Khitan settlements and completely destroyed the very foundation of their lives. The scene where he did not stop at simply killing enemies but rescued and returned with 10,000 Goguryeo people who had been taken by the Khitan shows a moving passage that he was a ruthless conqueror, but at the same time, an infinitely reliable protector and father-like monarch to his own people. However, true trials and glory awaited in the West, in the war against later Yan, the state of the Morang Shanbei, fighting for hegemony over the continent. At that time, later Yan was a powerful nomadic cavalry state commanding the northern part of the Central Plains, and was an unavoidable destined rival of Goguryeo over the hegemony of Liaodong, and their king, Morang Bao, had underestimated Goguryeo and staged provocations several times. Gwanggaeto freely employed not only head-on collisions but also dispersion tactics and surprise operations that caught the enemy off guard, toying with the later Yan army. The site of key defensive strongholds of the Liaodong Peninsula, such as Liaodong Fortress, Sinshang, and Namsosang, collapsing like dominoes, was terror itself to the later Yan army. Especially, the destructive power shown by Goguryeo main force, the Gaemamusa, on the plains was beyond imagination. The vibration generated when thousands of horses ran simultaneously shook the ground like an earthquake, and the murderous intent they emitted caused the enemy to lose their will to fight and flee even before clashing swords. The equipment of the Goguryeo army was the aggregate of the most advanced iron-making technology in East Asia at the time. The horse armor covering even the horse's face and the lamellar armor made by weaving plates bounced off enemy arrows and spears, boasting invincible defensive power. The kinetic energy generated when these heavy cavalrymen charged at the enemy lines holding long spears was enough to tear apart infantry squares like paper, and what happened inside the collapsed formation was not a battle, but a unilateral massacre. In operating these iron cavalrymen, Gwanggaeto did not simply push with force, but employed modern tactics combining luring operations using light cavalry, ambushes, and high-level psychological warfare such as cutting off supply routes to completely isolate and annihilate the enemy. The event of annihilating the Grand Army of later Yan at the Battle of Sukgunshang and completely taking control of Liaodong was a massive signal flare, announcing that Goguryeo had reversed the defensive stance of Korean Peninsula, states that had lasted for hundreds of years and ascended as the undeniable hegemon of Northeast Asia. However, the god of war gave no time to rest, as an urgent call for help from the south made him turn the horse's hooves again. In 400 AD, King Nimal of Silla was besieged by the allied forces of Baekje, Gaea, and Wa Japan from across the sea, facing a crisis of national survival, and he sent a humiliating but desperate state letter to Gwanggaeto, saying, "I will become a vassal and serve you all my life, so please save us." The decision Gwanggaeto made at this time was a large-scale expedition hard to find parallels for in history. He led a massive force of 50,000 infantry and cavalry and dashed across hundreds of kilometers of long distance from Goguryeo to Seorabeol Jongju of Silla, crossing mountain ranges and rivers in a single breath. The Wa army, which had been encamped in Silla's capital, began to retreat in terror as soon as the banners of the Goguryeo army appeared over the horizon, which clearly shows how great an object of fear the name, Goguryeo, was to neighboring countries at the time. The Goguryeo army entering Jongju chased the fleeing allied forces of Wa and Gaea, advancing to the Imnagara Gimhae region. This was the first event where Goguryeo's military power was projected deep into the southern part of the Korean peninsula, and a decisive moment, completely reshaping the balance of power on the peninsula. In the battles fought in the wetlands and plains of the Nakdong River basin, Goguryeo's iron cavalry roamed the battlefield like fish in water, and even Gaea's iron civilization collapsed helplessly before Goguryeo's overwhelming force. As a result of this expedition, Silla came under Goguryeo's influence, Jeomgwan Gaea walked the path of decline, and Hua had to abandon its ambition for the Korean peninsula and flee to their islands. Gwanggaeto had decided the fate of the southern peninsula in the palm of his hand with a single expedition. But his gaze did not remain on this small peninsula. His sword point was burning again toward the west, toward the unfinished, decisive battle with later Yan and the wider continent. Gwanggaeto the Great, having pacified the southern seas, began to drive his horses' hooves fiercely toward the northern heartland. The Liaoxi region, once again this was the final decisive battle to sever the ill-fated relationship with the nemesis later Yan, which had persistently held Goguryeo back. The massive offensive that began in 402 was not a simple localized war, but a total war staking the fate of the nation, and the Goguryeo army crossed the Liao River and advanced with irresistible force toward the enemy capital, Dragon City Longcheng. At that time, later Yan's Emperor Murongxi was indulging in luxury and pleasure, and before the Goguryeo Iron Cavalry rushing in like angry waves, later, Yan's defense line collapsed futilely like rotten straw fortresses considered impregnable, such as Sukgunsheng and Yong'an, knelt one by one under the banner of. Finally, in 407, unable to withstand Goguryeo pressure, a rebellion occurred within later Yan, leading to the assassination of Murongxi and the ascension of Ko-un, a descendant of the Goguryeo royal family, as the emperor of northern Yan. This was a historic triumph, signifying that Goguryeo had effectively completely mastered not only the Liaoxi region but also the political landscape of the northern Central Plains. Now, a situation arose where no country in Northeast Asia dared to aim a bowstring at Goguryeo, and Gwanggaeto turned his eyes east in 410, carrying out a final royal campaign toward eastern Buyo Domye and Okjo regions, which had not yet been subjugated. When the king's army reached the border, the castles of eastern Buyo opened their gates and surrendered without even daring to fight, showing that Gwanggaeto's dignity, which suppressed enemies without wielding a sword, had reached a mythical realm. With this, Goguryeo completed an unprecedentedly vast territory in the history of the Korean people, extending west across the Liao River deep into the Central Plains, north beyond the Manchurian Plains to near Siberia, east to the Primorsky Krai, and south to the Han River Basin. The empire he achieved was not merely an expansion of territory, but the moment of completing a worldview centered on Goguryeo-centric Tianxiao, using the independent era name, Yeongnak, serving as the center of the world equal to or surpassing the empires of the Central Plains. However, fate cruelly prepared the most tragic ending at the moment. He stood at the peak, this unrivaled hero, who spent his entire life on horseback roaming battlefields, suddenly passed away in 412 at the unbelievably young age of 39. History does not record his specific cause of death, but the speculation that the extreme physical fatigue and mental pressure he endured while commanding battlefields without a single moment of rest for 22 years since ascending the throne at 18 stopped his heart only adds to the sorrow of those left behind. When the news of his death spread, all of Goguryeo turned into a sea of wailing, and even the kings of neighboring countries, who had feared him, shuddered at the fall of a great star and sent condolence envoys. His presence was an era itself, transcending enemies and allies. His son, King Jongsu, to honor his great father's achievements, cut a massive stone block, the largest in the east at the time, standing 6.39 meters tall and weighing 37 tons, and carved upon it the history of conquest stained with his father's blood and sweat. This is the Gwanggaeto stele that stands tall in Jian, Jilin Province, China, today. The 1,775 characters of the inscription contain the pride that Goguryeo is the nation of the descendants of heaven and the full weight of the posthumous name, Gukgangsang Gwanggaeto Jeong Pyongan Haraewang, achieved by Gwanggaeto devoting his entire life. The stele has stood upright for over 1,000 years, weathering wind and rain, eloquently testifying to the spirit of Goguryeo that commanded the Manchurian plains and the glory of a forgotten empire. But today, that land has become another country's territory, standing lonely in a place beyond our reach. Gwanggaeto the Great was not simply a conquering monarch who expanded lands, but a spiritual pillar who instilled pride and confidence in the Goguryeo people, who were groaning under barren environments and surrounding threats, saying, "We are the center of the world." On the earth he packed down with horse hooves. Goguryeo was able to reign as the strongest power in Northeast Asia for over 200 years thereafter, and the indomitable spirit he showed became the source of the hot dynamism flowing in our veins today. Even now, it feels as if the roars of tens of thousands of iron cavalrymen are mixed in the sound of the wind in Manchuria and standing before the masses. Still, one can almost hear the rough breathing of a man who galloped across the continent 1,600 years ago. We call him the god of conquest, but perhaps he wishes to be remembered as Damdeok, the most lonely and intense human who dreamed of a strong country where his people could live in peace, even while he was covered in blood on the battlefield all his life.